one man raced against time to save 669 children as Nazi forces closed in. As Hitler expanded his grip on Europe, Britain opened its doors to children fleeing Germany and Austria. But in Czechoslovakia, no such rescue effort existed. Parents were desperate. Borders were closing. And no one, not governments, not world leaders, was coming to save them. In a cramped hotel room in Prague, one man refused to look away. He wasn't a diplomat. He wasn't a spy. He wasn't even 30. He was a young stockbroker who stumbled into history. By day, he worked at the London Stock Exchange. By night, he forged visas, bribed officials, and arranged trains to carry hundreds of children to safety before the Nazis sealed Czechoslovakia off from the world. So, how did an ordinary man pull off one of the greatest rescues of the Holocaust? Nicholas Winton grew up with every advantage. Born in London to German Jewish parents who had converted to Christianity, he attended elite schools and trained in banking across Germany and France. For a young man in his 20s, life was all wine-filled evenings and plans for the future. Politics, and his heritage, barely crossed his mind. Then came the Great Depression. Winton's training was cut short, and back in London, he found a city transformed. Men lined up at job centers. Children begged at soup kitchens. Families crammed into tiny apartments. The suffering he once watched from afar was now right outside his door. Shaken, Winton joined the Labour Party, determined to help build a better world. But by late 1938, the world was headed somewhere far darker. Hitler had annexed Austria, greeted not with resistance, but with cheers. Jews were being dragged from their homes, beaten in the streets. Thousands of intellectuals and political opponents were shipped to camps. And now Britain and France, desperate to avoid war, handed Hitler the Sudetenland. Winton feared what others wouldn't admit. The Nazis wouldn't stop there. Czechoslovakia was next. The rest of Europe would soon follow. Then, in December 1938, as Winton packed for a ski trip, his phone rang. It was Martin Blake, a fellow labor activist calling from Prague. Blake was working with a British aid group scrambling to help refugees flooding in from the Sudetenland. "You need to come," he urged. It was just weeks after Kristallnacht when Nazi mobs rampaged throughout Germany and Austria, smashing windows, burning synagogues, and deporting thousands to camps. The violence was escalating. So was Winton's unease. He traded his skis for a notebook and a train ticket, and in Prague, he walked straight into the heart of a refugee crisis. Winton didn't waste time. Almost as soon as he arrived, he met Doreen Warrener, head of the British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia. She took him through the refugee camps on the outskirts of Prague, rows of makeshift tents, families huddled against the cold, children clutching their parents with wide, frightened eyes. The air was thick with desperation. Food was scarce. Disease was spreading. Every day, parents pleaded with Warrener, "Please, save our children." And every day, Winton watched her face as she admitted there was little she could do. The BCR was already stretched thin, their focus on helping adult political refugees escape Nazi arrest. But Winton couldn't stop asking himself, what about the children? That night, after another exhausting day of handing out aid, Warrener looked Winton in the eye and said, "Look, if anything can be done for the children, perhaps you'd like to try and do it." It was the spark Winton needed, so he began hatching a plan. After the horrors of Kristallnacht, Britain had agreed to take in a limited number of children from Nazi Germany and Austria. This rescue effort, later known as the Kindertransport, saved nearly 10,000 children, most of them Jewish. Winton couldn't stop thinking, could the same be done for Czech children now trapped in Hitler's shadow? He had no office, no staff, no budget, just a cheap hotel room and sheer determination. So he scrawled a sign and taped it to the door. Children's section of the British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia. It wasn't official, but it was a start. Soon after, he met Trevor Chadwick, an English schoolmaster who'd come to Prague to sponsor 2 refugee boys. When Winton laid out his plan, Chadwick didn't hesitate. He agreed to handle logistics on the ground if Winton could convince the British government to open its doors. But time was running out. Every day, Europe edged closer to war. Every delay meant more children trapped behind Nazi lines. The clock was ticking, and it seemed Nicholas Winton was the only one who could hear it. The British bureaucracy dragged its feet. When Winton pressed them, they shrugged him off, saying, "Why the rush? Nothing will happen in Europe." Maybe for the men lounging in London offices, there was time to spare, but Winton had walked the refugee camps. He had seen the desperation in parents' eyes, heard their whispered pleas. Those families, their children, they couldn't afford to wait. So Winton took matters into his own hands. From his cramped hotel room in Prague, he began taking applications. No government approval, no official sanction, just forged entry permits and a growing line of desperate parents. For them, the choice was brutal. Send their children to safety in Britain, knowing they might never see them again, or keep them close, knowing the Nazis were closing in. In a letter to his mother, Winton described the agony of one parent's question. How long will it be before my child can go? And will I ever be able to follow? It may be that circumstances will prevent this mother ever seeing her child again, if we succeed in getting it to England. Desperate times called for daring action. As word spread, more and more families came to Winton's hotel room, pleading for their children's lives. The flood of applications was so overwhelming, he had to set up a formal office. After 3 grueling weeks of paperwork and desperate meetings, Winton returned to London clutching a list of 900 names, 900 children whose lives now depended on his next move. Finally, the British Home Office gave its approval, both 2 crushing conditions. First, Winton had to secure a foster home for every single child until they turned 18. Second, he had to raise £50 per child, a staggering sum, to guarantee their eventual return home. It was an impossible task, but Winton refused to back down. With no official support from the overwhelmed refugee committee, he turned his own London home into a makeshift command center. He enlisted a handful of volunteers, led by his own mother, and got to work. By day, Winton quietly traded stocks, blending in at the London Stock Exchange. By night, he became something else entirely. He launched a nationwide campaign, placing urgent ads in newspapers, pinning photos of refugee children on church and synagogue bulletin boards, and writing directly to President Roosevelt, begging the US to take them in. Roosevelt never replied. Still, against all odds, the responses began to trickle in. Hours blurred into days as Winton pored over lists of children, matching each name with a foster family. He scrambled to raise funds for the trains while coordinating with the officials, volunteers, and transport companies to keep the rescue alive. Once the lists were ready, Winton sent them back to Prague into the hands of Trevor Chadwick and Doreen Warner. Their job was even more daunting, convincing Gestapo officers to approve exit permits for hundreds of Jewish children. Securing trains was another hurdle. Escorts had to be arranged to shepherd the children across hostile territory, often Chadwick and Warner themselves risking their lives on Nazi-controlled railways. Back in London, Winton managed the final step, ensuring every host family was waiting at the Liverpool train station to greet the children as they stepped off the train. But no matter how carefully they planned, new obstacles kept erupting. The Gestapo would suddenly demand staggering bribes, sometimes thousands of pounds, or threaten to cancel the transports. Winton and his team scrambled to raise the money, knowing every delay could mean lives lost. The clock was ticking. Nazi control of Czechoslovakia was tightening. Winton knew he had to move faster. And then, after 2 relentless months, the moment came. The first transport of children organized by Winton left by plane from Prague for London. In London, host families waited with open arms. For the first time, Winton and his team allowed themselves a breath of relief. Against all odds, they had done it. The first group was safe, but their victory was short-lived. The very next day, Nazi troops stormed into Czechoslovakia. The borders tightened. The danger escalated. Winton and his team had no choice. They raced to organize as many transports as possible before time ran out. Each train brought a wave of relief, but also unbearable heartbreak. At Prague station, parents clung to their children until the very last possible moment. Faces pressed to the glass, hands grasping at one final touch, one last look. Some sobbed openly. Others forced brave smiles, whispering lies they hoped their children would believe. It's just a little trip. We'll see you soon. One child recalled, "My parents, in order to get me on the train, misled me into believing I was going on an adventure. I had no idea it was the last time I would see my father alive, and that they were destined to the hellhole of Auschwitz." Another remembered, all of the parents were crying and waving. I can still see them today. I can remember the parents' hands up and our noses pressed to the glass. The most frequently uttered sentence along the platform was, "See you soon." The journey itself was harrowing. The children traveled first by train through Nazi-controlled territory, then crossed the English Channel by ship, and finally boarded another train into London. Each was allowed only a small suitcase and a meager food bag. Nazi officers routinely stormed the carriages, rifling through their belongings, barking orders, and spreading terror among the young passengers. And yet, reaching London wasn't the end of their ordeal. It was only the start of another. Torn from their families, their language, and their faith, many struggled to adjust. Some were welcomed with kindness and love. Others faced neglect, mistreatment, even servitude. Winton's mother stepped in, helping rehome children who ended up in unsafe placements. Her quiet compassion, an extension of her son's mission. Despite the challenges, Winton never doubted his mission, as he later said. The worst that would happen to them in England was better than being in the fire. By late summer 1939, his efforts had saved 669 children from the Nazis' grasp. But one final transport, the largest yet, was still to come. On September 1st, 1939, 250 hopeful children were scheduled to depart Prague. Their parents had said their tearful goodbyes. Their bags were packed, their names on Winton's list. But that morning, the world changed forever. Winton's deepest fears had become reality. Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. Chaos swept across Europe. Borders slammed shut. The train was canceled before it could leave the station. Later, Winton learned the devastating truth. Nearly all 250 children were deported to Terezin, then to Auschwitz. All but 2 perished. The thought haunted him for the rest of his life. If only the train had left 1 day earlier, they might have lived. The rescue effort came to an abrupt and tragic end. In Prague, Chadwick and Warner were forced to flee, hunted for their work helping refugees. Back in England, Winton carried on. Though tormented by the children he couldn't save, he threw himself into the war effort, working in civil defense, driving ambulances for the Red Cross, and training night pilots in the RAF. When peace finally returned, Winton didn't slow down. He helped redistribute Nazi-looted property to refugees, then worked on US loan programs rebuilding post-war Europe. It was in Paris he met Grete, the woman he would marry and raise 3 children with. Through it all, Winton barely spoke of his rescue mission. He didn't think it was extraordinary. To him, it was simple. There were children who needed saving, and he had the means to help. It took 50 years for the world to discover what Nicholas Winton had done. In 1988, while cleaning their attic, Winton's wife found a dusty scrapbook. Inside were photos, letters, and lists of names, hundreds of children he had helped save. They weren't just old papers, they were lives. Grete shared the scrapbook with a Holocaust historian who began tracking down the survivors. Soon after, a BBC program called That's Life picked up the story and invited Winton to join the studio audience for its broadcast.
In all, Nicholas Winton and the committees who helped him managed to save 664 children. This is his scrapbook.
What he didn't know was that the audience was filled with those very children, now middle-aged adults, parents and grandparents themselves. In an unforgettable moment, Winton looked around and realized he was surrounded by hundreds of lives that existed because of him.
Can I ask, is there anyone in our audience tonight who owes their life to Nicholas Winton? If so, could you stand up, please? Mr. Winton, would you like to turn round? You'll have the chance to meet these people properly after the programme. In the meantime, Mr. Winton, on behalf of all of them, thank you very much indeed.
Later that year, Winton reunited with the survivors who spoke openly about their journeys, the relief in crossing into Holland and being handed hot chocolate, and the lifelong ache of having left their families behind. As Winton's story spread, the world began to honor him. Recognition from Israel, honorary citizenship in Prague, and a knighthood from Queen Elizabeth II. In 2024, his life inspired the film One Life. But Winton, ever humble, often deflected the praise. I wasn't heroic because I was never in danger, he insisted, giving credit to Warner and Chadwick, who had risked their lives in Prague. Even about the BBC reunion, he joked, I wasn't best pleased to have been tricked for television drama and bucketfuls of tears. Winton passed away in 2015 at the age of 106. He left behind not only his family, but a vast extended family, thousands of survivors and their descendants, all owing their lives to a 29-year-old stockbroker who refused to look away. Winton often said it took no special skill to do what he did, just effort, just initiative. His legacy reminds us, you don't need power, you don't need privilege. Sometimes, all it takes is the courage to act.